Hello, everyone. To those just tuning in, welcome. To those who've been checking out sessions throughout the day, welcome back. We hope you're enjoying the content and looking forward to more awesome presentations coming up. A big thank you to our partners and speakers for helping us deliver a fantastic program. A quick reminder to join our Slack channel to interact with other attendees and join selected speakers for Q&A. You can find the link in the menu at the top of this page. Happy viewing.
Hi, my name is Apurva. I work at Chegg, a company that addresses learning needs of college students across the world. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here with me today. I'm really happy to be here myself and share a few stories I've learned along the way on my product journey. Since this isn't an interactive session, I know it's going to be a little challenging to keep the discussion organic, but before we wrap up, I'll share my contact in case you want to reach out. Product means different things in different companies, and sometimes even to people at different points in their career path. I'm sure there's some among you today that are looking to launch the very first version of your product. And there's others that are looking to take an existing product and scale it to new users, to new markets, or to meet new targets. Maybe there's some entrepreneurs that are looking to validate product market fit. One tool that's useful in almost any of these situations is, no surprise, data. But how do you gather the right kind of data? How do you know what are the right questions to ask? What do you do when you don't have the data that needs to be available or reliable on time? And how do you connect the dots to blend the art and the science to make decisions in these situations? That's something we're going to explore today. The topic of our discussion is blending product and business success with the right goals. Over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'd like to share with you stories of how you can navigate the unknowns and forge your path with this framework in mind. But before we jump in, here's a little bit about me. I stumbled into computer science in high school and was initially pretty daunted by buzzwords like microprocessor programming kits and low-level systems languages that seemed to be really exciting to the rest of my classmates. What drew me to the subject, and even today gets me excited, is the logical reasoning and step-by-step problem solving that applies in almost every situation. So I graduated with computer science and then started out as a back-end engineer on Windows Azure at Microsoft. And I loved my time as an engineer. It was fascinating to understand the guts of a system and really see how empowering every line of code could be. But a few years in, I decided that my next challenge lay in defining the why before the how. And that's what took me down the path of product management. In the years since, I've navigated roles at both large companies and small. And the one thing I will say, as it relates to the topic at hand today, is that ambiguity is one constant VPMs encounter in almost every day of our life. It could relate to strategy, to launch decisions, to influencing without direct authority, or even in the relationships we build at work. But those that succeed are those that thrive with in this kind of an environment. They understand where they are, they make reasonable assumptions to find a path forward, and iteratively revisit those assumptions to make sure that they are on course to achieving their goals. Which is why goals are a really important toolkit along the way. Some of you may be familiar with this picture. It's infamously known as the new Coke, except that it didn't stay new for too long. In spring 1984, Coca-Cola was in a really difficult situation. Its market share had plunged 36% since its high, and it was facing really stiff competition from Pepsi. The leadership knew something had to change, and what followed was one of the most exhaustive product testing processes in history. Hundreds of consumers blind sip tested thousands of different formula over several months. And within a year, they'd found a newer, sweeter recipe which outperformed both Old Coke and Pepsi in the sip tests that they'd run. The launch was a complete disaster, and ultimately the company was forced to reintroduce the old formula. So what went wrong? In part, The company had underestimated the emotion attached to Old Coke, and people had reacted the way they did because of that emotion. But that wasn't it. The way they measured trials of New Coke, the sip test, was deeply flawed. When people drink a cola at home, they don't have a sip, they drink an entire can. And while consumers prefer a sweeter sip during the test, over the course of a dinner, a football game, or an evening out, it just becomes sickly. Put simply, they'd measured the wrong thing. So the moral of the story is measuring the right thing in the wrong way or the wrong thing in the right way can be really fatal. And this is as true for product managers as it was for the world's favorite soda. One of the most common philosophies I hear debated is product goals versus business goals. However, in my experience, the most successful products out there are built by companies that have a single North Star metric, which is critical to the business success. Groups across the company then identify goals and KPIs that correlate with this North Star metric. And when this cascades across groups, across squads, and every person at the company is able to tie back what they're working on to this North Star, that's where you create focus, synergy, and best practices that really keep everyone marching in the same direction. This is explored a little bit in the Design of Everyday Things, a book by Don Norman. The example he uses is smartphones, which have been on the market since the 1980s, but only became popular towards the end of the millennium. Why is that? For years, PMs and designers considered the smartphone a user experience innovation. They focused on usability that led to high quality screens, but these were just way too expensive for mass adoption. And businesses are, of course, focused on getting the most exposure and the most usage. But this was only possible with inexpensive touchscreens that were too difficult to use. For a product to succeed, the product and the business goals need to be in harmony. Products need to not just be engaging to the user, but they also need to strive for business success. And that's why years later, when touchscreen prices came down and the usability features that drove innovation and engagement could be accommodated, smartphones took the world by storm. So let's say you've now really aligned your goals and have a clear definition of what success looks like. You also need to know what needs to be measured and how it needs to be measured. What's next? How do you get to the next level of detail to create data-informed products? Here's a simple framework I found really helpful in almost every product challenge I've had. You start by asking yourself who the user is. At a product like Chegg, is the user the student or is it the parent? If it's the student, is the student domestic or in an international market? What year or major are they enrolled in? Are they a current subscriber or is it their first time on the product? Asking yourself questions like these will build a deeper understanding of who your user is and allow you to empathize with the kind of problems they really run into along their journey. The next question I ask myself is, what problem are we solving? And more importantly, the following one, which is, why is solving the problem important? This is a critical piece of the puzzle. In defining the problem to be solved, it's important to get to the root cause of the problem versus scratching the surface. The more real the problem, the more effective you'll be at solving it. But even more importantly, by asking yourself why solving the problem is important, you can connect the dots back to the goal you defined at the start and make sure the problem will make a big enough dent on the goal. Next, you ask yourself what the hypothesis is. And in doing so, you'd be able to connect your problem more directly to your goal. If you find yourself struggling here, you either haven't found the right problem to solve or you need to revisit your goal. What are the success criteria is my next question. And usually it's possible to break this down into a couple of different levers. There are levers that you could directly influence. And then there are levers or KPIs that are secondarily influenced by the primary levers. For example, let's say Spotify is planning to launch a feature that brings recommendations into their playlist. The primary KPI would then be to see how many users that are exposed to those recommendations engage with them. This is a strong signal or sign of life on the quality and the usefulness of those recommendations. The second order metric could then be the overall retention rate of the users that qualified for the recommendations. And by looking at that, you could really tie it back into the long-term behaviors of the users across the product. Last but not the least, you get to solve the problem by asking yourself how you actually solve it. And this is a great point to start digging into use cases and designs and all the goodness that product managers and designers thrive on. Ultimately, PMs that really push on and articulate questions 1 through 5 are the ones that have a much higher success of meeting their goals than ones that drive straight into use cases. So let's take an example, one I've used on several interviews with PM candidates. I start with an intentionally ambiguous question: build a toothbrush for a toddler. Most candidates jump right into the use cases and talk about Disney characters, bright colors, and soft bristles, all of which may be good features. However, because they aren't working back from goals or problems, they hit 2 roadblocks. 1, they stumble on how they define success. And 2, the solution doesn't come across as particularly creative because their ideas aren't solving a real problem. In contrast, the winning answers start with defining success: number of units used, time to finish brushing, or even a qualitative metric like a happy parent or a happy child. The problems they touch on are real. Any parent that out here can attest to. Getting kids to brush at all, or to brush for the right amount of time on a daily basis without drama. And that leads them to creative answers like timers and toothbrushes with covers and grip. So here's a recap of your goal toolkit. Start by understanding the business model based on which you can identify or align on the North Star KPIs. The business model is a key determinant of your North Star. But once you have it, as you build new products, ensure they have measurable KPIs that tie back to the North Star. To do that, in cases where the association isn't obvious, you may need to work with your data science teams to build correlation models and create goals against the KPIs that have a correlation with your North Star. This is particularly true for new areas or new features that may not have a clear definition of success. And the more you can spend time upfront defining what you're trying to move and correlate it back to the North Star, the more likely you're going to be measuring the right thing. So what are some good examples of North Star KPIs and use cases? Let's find out with a few examples. Let's start with Amazon. Amazon's business model is e-commerce, so its North Star KPI is likely around customer lifetime value. Of course, this is going to be different for different segments and different age groups. But ultimately, the customer's lifetime value is a reflection of Amazon's business success. Depending on what team you work at, this KPI could break down into a few different ones. For instance, if you work on one of Amazon's verticals like groceries or fashion products, you're probably looking at number of purchases per month per customer. Note that a period like a month is large enough to smoothen out outliers like weekend purchases or those associated with a specific event. If your team drives top of funnel search traffic to Amazon, you might look at share of traffic by channel. Or if you work on the search product and your launches drive reductions in reformulation, which is the user's behavior when they need to keep retyping their query so the search engine gets it right, you might be looking at reformulation rates as your success criteria. Alternatively, if you're working on Amazon's music or video products, you might want to look at streaming minutes with the underlying assumption that the more customers stream, the deeper their relationship with Amazon, and that ties back to the North Star. Let's take another example. Let's look at something like Slack. For a product like Slack, where success is closely tied to the daily engagement of users, the North Star would relate to volume of messages exchanged per day. Depending on which team you work on at Slack, you could tap one of different levers to this North Star: breadth of engagement with daily active users, or depth of engagement with average usage in minutes per day. In addition, given that activating new users sooner could get them to be more productive, you could also look at a metric like first time engagement for new users. Both the examples we just looked at relate to established products that have clear baselines on metrics. But what if you're working on the first version of a product that has no baseline? In that world, how would you measure success? Airbnb was that 0 to 1 product back in 2009. When the founders talked to Paul Graham as part of the Y Combinator program they were in, he asked them where their users were. And when he found out they were in New York, he pushed them out of Mountain View, where the YC is based, to go speak with their real users in New York. This, of course, won't scale when you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, but that's even more important why you speak to them in those early days. And it's when they did that they uncovered a treasure trove of ideas and information that played a critical role in shaping their product. If you heard the podcast Handcrafted on Masters of Scale, you'll hear Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, talk about how the founders themselves went to the homes of hosts to take photographs and through those conversations got insights. For instance, hosts didn't feel comfortable with unknown guests, and they would open up when they saw a picture of the guest or the school or the company that the guest worked at. It's through these handcrafted experiences that Airbnb's scale was born, because they solve real user problems by talking to the users themselves. So when you don't have the data or the baselines, work backward from user problems and use your product intuition to create hypotheses that feel right, and then go test and learn. So in reflecting on the stories I've told you today, you probably already know how to define a good metric. To touch on a few characteristics, it's understandable by anyone at the company. It should closely mirror how users are feeling. It has a baseline because if you haven't measured something, how do you improve it? It's comparable to this baseline, and over a period of time, it's found to be effective in driving the success your company wants to drive. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, Lean Analytics is a good place to start. If you've been using these metrics and still failing, it's a good time to go back and think about which of these characteristics the metric is failing on. And if you were to replace it, which characteristic you need to optimize for and what metric you'd then pick. One powerful need that KPIs also serve is their ability to empower teams. At Chegg, for instance, the North Star KPI for my team is net active members. This breaks down into new users we acquire and existing ones we retain. Acquisition in turn breaks down into top of funnel, traffic, and CVR, whereas retention breaks down into activation of new users, engagement, or even the quality of our content. This breakdown of KPIs has deeply influenced how I've organized my team, with squads formed around the key levers of the North Star KPI. Doing so empowers the teams to explore solutions that will impact their goals and gives them a clear sense of ownership. Does this mean that the teams don't intersect in the products or that they don't have intersecting charters? Of course not. But because everyone's working backwards from the same goals, they see these as opportunities to collaborate and partner. So to sum up, here's your data arsenal: North Star metrics, use case KPIs, goals, and when all of the above are difficult to get because you're working on the first version of a product, speak to your users. And A/B test when the stakes are high and confidence is low. Use dashboards and invest in building them from the get-go. Last but not the least, debate, discuss, and diagnose, all of which are healthy ways for the team to feel aligned and stay aligned on the big picture. It was my pleasure to be here with all of you today. My LinkedIn profile is listed here in case you want to reach out and discuss any of the topics we covered. Happy producting!